Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for a presentation by Museum Executive Director Emeritus, Mr. Greg Koos. We're very excited to welcome him back and talk about Irish immigration this afternoon. This is a part of our ongoing Lunch and Learn series, which is presented by MCK Advisors. We're very grateful for their support, as well as the support of WGLT, who sponsors all of our live streams. It's WGLT, Bloomington Normal's public media, part of the NPR network. So without further ado, Greg Koos.
Thank you. This should work. I just want to warn you that I went to a Catholic high school, so me and technology are not the best of friends. Actually, we thought that audiovisual meant a very loud none. So we'll see whether, what happens with this. In any case, greeting of the Prairie, Irish immigration into the Corn Belt. And you may have noticed in publicity that went out on this that was going to be Irish immigration into the upper Midwest. And since I had been using that title, I will discuss one of the discoveries I made about the Corn Belt, its extent, and the extent of Irish immigration. My sainted great-great-grandmother, Mary Motherway O'Neill, is in many ways responsible for my presence today. And I will be referring to her immigration story on again, off again. She emigrated in 1851 with 9 children and 2 cousins. And they landed in New Orleans. And so we'll talk about some of her experiences as we talk about Irish immigration into the Corn Belt. See, aha. I told you. There we go. Thank you. Okay, I'll go back. Okay, good. So what we're going to look at is what the Irish American Corn Belt might look like, about people leaving Ireland, people landing in New Orleans, because that's when Mary Motherway came over. She landed in New Orleans in February of 1851, and how riverboats were in a large part because New Orleans was not the destination that everybody had. I'll talk about some of the states settled, and then talk about McLean County as a case example, and then leave you with some questions, one of which we've been able to answer recently, about what we do and don't know about Irish settlement. Okay. So one of the things that I learned, and this is the discovery, is if you look at the 1870 census, there's a map compiled by the people of the 1870 census, and the darker the color indicates the location of Irish settlement. And then just use your mind to transfer that image over to a map, a current map of what's considered to be the Corn Belt. And what you'll see is that it's coterminous, that the Irish people who became farmers, because we're talking about farm settlement, that's the point of what I'm going to be talking about, they ultimately formed an important part of the population of the farmers who farmed and created the Corn Belt. There were Germans, a lot of Germans in there and whatnot. Essentially, there's about 100,000 families involved in that settlement process from 1850 to about 1880. And they started their own places. They started their own towns. When you farm, you have to have a grain elevator to have a grain elevator. That's where you sell your grain. You got to have a railroad. And so you get to name these little places. And they had marvelous towns: Erin, Prairie, Emerald, Ossian, Tara, Clontarf, O'Neill, Cahill Town. So across the landscape, you see these little crossroads towns with these distinctive Irish names. So there is clearly a relationship between what we understand as the Corn Belt today and Irish settlement. Leaving was a painful thing. The Irish were not voluntary immigrants in a typical manner. They were mostly refugees in this period, and my period of my study is 1840 to 1870. And you're never supposed to read text that's up on a PowerPoint screen. I don't believe that. So I want you to hear Bridget Nihill's testament about leaving. As we were traveling along, conveyed by our old members, a woman, barefooted and bareheaded, with no covering except a sheet to protect her from the cruel October blasts, darted out from a neighboring hedge, twined her arms around Mother's neck, and kissed her passionately as tears streamed down her face. And invoking a blessing upon my mother for her many acts of kindness to her, again darted back under the shelter of the hedge, where her body was afterward found, she having died of cold and hunger. It was a painful leaving. And what we know is that the Irish leaving, the immigration, was an important part of a cotton and Irish trade. We have to look at immigrants as commodities because that's how they were treated. And in a view of people operating the ships, operating the immigration lines, the Irish were a perfect commodity for a return trip of boats, ships, whose principal purpose was hauling cotton from the levees of New Orleans to Liverpool, which was a port of entry for Manchester, which is the location of the great textile mills of England. And so the amount of traffic was huge, 300, 400 ships a year, hauling millions of tons of cotton. And what to bring back? What better to bring back than immigrants? And the people who ran these things said, you know, the immigrants were not really particularly treated well because nobody cared if they broke, like if you were hauling pottery, nor if they were injured, did anybody require you to pay for them or compensate them. So they were a perfect cargo, and they were treated as cargo. From 1844 to 1845, about 1 million landed in New York. And New York was a return place for cotton trade because New York was the second most important cotton harbor in the United States. It gathered cotton from coastal steamers, getting the South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, those cottons, Virginia cotton, and hauling it up to New York when it was then shipped to Manchester. 100,000 landed in New Orleans, as far as I've been able to get, and then after 1855, another 30,000. So we know that about 135,000 immigrants were part of this cotton trade, landed in New Orleans. So when you're doing your work on family history or whatnot, you will find German immigrants and Irish immigrants in this period almost invariably leaving through Liverpool. And it turned that the immigrant trade, in many ways, made the cotton trade more profitable because there was the return trip. And so the port of New Orleans becomes the place for the ships to land, but not necessarily the place of the dream of the immigrant. The ad reads, shipping, cheapest and most direct route to the western states of America, Illinois, Iowa, Wisconsin, St. Louis, Dubuque, and Ohio. Now, I really like that because they're making Dubuque, a town in Iowa, into a state. And what that means is that the immigrants would have heard of Dubuque. They knew about Dubuque, and so it's in the ad because it gives people a sense of familiarity of where it is that you're going. James O'Toole, who was a broker, can everybody read that? Oh, I ought to go to the slide. There we go. There's a slide, by golly. Cotton bales in Liverpool. So when we're at the port of New Orleans, O'Toole writes his advertising copy. New Orleans is a very desirable point for the immigrant whose intention is to settle in the fine farming country of the West, as they can be conveyed to their destination more quietly, cheaper, and comfortably, besides being less exposed to imposition from any other of the northern ports. Now, the importance of this statement is that in Irish American historiography, the current theories, which are now being overturned, but they're still current, was that the Irish had a psychological barrier that prevented them from becoming farmers. And so most of the contemporary Irish history books, Irish American history books, say there were no Irish farmers. It's flat out just, that's a statement, there are no Irish farmers. Actually, this museum lost a grant from the National Endowment for Humanities because we were writing about Irish farmers, and the review panel said, well, everybody knows there weren't any Irish farmers. You know, everybody knows this, you know. That cost us $180,000, that piece of ignorance. Now, this is the bit. This is why I'm doing this, because by God, I'm going to set the record straight on this thing, and nobody's going to lose a $180,000 grant for talking about Irish farmers again. So that's, everybody has a life goal. That's my life goal. You know. So we're looking at here, what you're hearing here is stuff that has not been looked at before. Okay, this is all brand new stuff. Okay, emigration leads to death. We don't think about it that often. Scally makes a pretty sound argument saying that the act of emigration, which exposes you to the hazards of travel, to bad shipping, and in particular, because of crowded quarters, the hazards of disease. And so when you look at the toll of humanity that comes from immigration, you have to look at this broader picture. You just don't look at, well, how many people died in the so-called coffin ships? That's a figure that quite often is cited, but it's a far broader number because there's so many other things that are involved in issues of immigration. For instance, Reverend John Hanlon, who's this guy here, interesting guy, St. Louis priest, darn good writer. He said that there were more people who were killed by explosions and sinkings and burnings of steamboats on the Mississippi River than died in the passage from Liverpool to New York or New Orleans. So coming up the river, because these people were not, remember what I said earlier, they were not headed to New Orleans, they were headed to the farming states. And so New Orleans is just an entree point, and St. Louis is more of the destination. And the lives that were lost were huge. It's a very dangerous trip. The O'Neills learned that. The O'Neills landed in New Orleans, and when they left New Orleans about 2 years after landing they landed in February '51 in St. Louis, and about another 2 years they went upriver into Bloomington, actually. But what happened to them is that it was time for them to get on the boat. They were going to get on the boat called the Captain Kearney, which was going from St. Louis to Alton, and the oldest son, Philip, who, you know, loved to have his drinks, couldn't be found, and so the other brothers were sent out looking in the bars in St. Louis to find him and drag him back so they could all get going, and so therefore they were late, and the Captain Kearney blew up on the way to Alton, killed about everybody on board. So I like to say, but for the grace of God and Philip's drinking habit, I wouldn't be here, you know. But it isn't just, you know, that, there's more. Disease. Okay, New Orleans was a place where people would land and try to figure out how they could get the money to go further, try to get themselves grounded a little bit. And in 1853, there was a massive yellow fever epidemic, which killed over 3,500 Irish that 1 year. So those are deaths from migration. You know, they weren't there, they were pushed there. And the reason why they were so susceptible to yellow fever was that they were physically worn down from the trip, from the transatlantic voyage, so they were not in the best of health anyway. The accommodations they had when they were in New Orleans were the lowest and the worst accommodations. If you landed there between April and September, or October, the Anopheles mosquito is particularly active, and so that's essentially what happens, is that they are there being ignorant of the weather conditions and the issues of public health. They wouldn't know anything about that. They would land and die, you know. They're crowded together, bad hospitals. It was not a good situation. So getting up there, of course, to St. Louis, getting out of New Orleans, the O'Neills were told that there was no good prospects for an Irishman in New Orleans and leave immediately. That was their advice. They landed in New Orleans and they were told, get out of here, get up to St. Louis as quick as you can. But that trip, as we talked about, could be really dangerous. Between 1848 and 1852, about 1,100 people were killed on riverboat explosions. Now, the image I have here is of the Sultana, which was a Army riverboat that killed 1,100 passengers, I think, in a fire in 1865. But it gives us a sense of what happens to one of these wooden things that are floating, that 130 passengers were, how do I want to put this? The boilers in a steamboat are back here, okay? And first class passage is up here, and immigrant passage is down there, okay? And so the immigrants are closest to the boilers. And by the way, immigrants weren't registered by name. They just, they paid their $3 passage, and that's all they needed. So whenever these things exploded, and dozens and dozens and dozens of these things exploded, killing many people on board, there was no track of exactly. I'd say 60 Irish were killed. It just was terrible. In the case of the A.N. Johnson, which blew up with a bunch of immigrants, about, what does it say? About 114 were killed. So it was not a good trip. Okay, it was dangerous. It was hazardous. But getting there, if you could get through all of that. St. Louis. And St. Louis was another entree point in terms of commodity exchange. And so out of St. Louis, the steamboats were functioning very much like the cotton Irish trade boats from Liverpool to New Orleans or Liverpool or New York. That is, that there were commodities coming downstream from Illinois, Ohio, Indiana, some from Iowa, and those commodities were then being exchanged for immigrants who were getting off these boats. And so that's many of the people who were involved in this said, basically, again, immigrants made the commodity trade affordable because you made enough money out of it. So 700 steamboats would land at the wharfs here, sometimes 300 at a time. Very busy. A place that was frustrating for residents of St. Louis because cholera in particular was a disease associated with steamboats. And so people coming up out of New Orleans who are, again, they're crowded together, 150, 200 on those decks, crowded together, mixed in, by the way, with livestock and barrels and all kinds of different other things, would come up in bad health. Quite often these boats would stop to bury people in a sandbank and continue on their way. Sometimes people would be pushed off the boats because it was so crowded. One story of a woman who's just trying to get a bucket of water. She has young children, and she's getting you had to get your own water. They provided nothing. No food, no water. You had to provide your own. She's got a bucket trying to get water out of the river. Works as in a sense as an anchor, pulls her off board and drowns her. that would never stop steamboats for somebody falling overboard, because the presumption was they would fall into the paddle wheels and there wouldn't be anything left. So what can I say? It was tough. The number here I had is 3,000 upriver steamboats landed in 1853 in St. Louis, and they hauled about 700,000 tons of cargo downstream. So the levees were the busiest place. St. Louis had by 1860, an Irish population. I believe the number is about 45,000. And I'm going to guess that about half of those were not permanent residents. And one of the things, and I can't get too deep into this, is became a question for the Archbishop of St. Louis, because they were essentially the people who were taking responsibility for caring for people. How can we get these people into a different life than doing the rough labor of stevedores, or the rough labor of working on the steamboats, or the rough labor of cutting timber for wood to burn in the steamboats, or making ties for the new railroads that were coming through. Well, the Irish themselves knew what they wanted was to farm. Because again, when you look at the ads, it says these are the farming states. And so going to New Orleans instead of St. Louis was a choice. It took about 2 to 3 weeks longer to go to New Orleans. It could take that much longer. So they do settle. They do start heading up into the upper Midwest. One of the things we talk about having land statements, and it's simply important to know that before, essentially 10 to 20 years before this immigration started for these folks, over 30 Algonquin-speaking tribes of Native Americans were displaced from their homes and displaced into states further to the west. And so these lands that the Irish were going to come in and settle were lands that had been associated with the lives of over 30 different tribes of Algonquin-speaking people, thousands of people. So in a very bitter way, if those of you know Irish history, the Irish are repeating the Cromwellian invasion of Ulster in their own invasion, if you will, of Iowa. And so and there would be those amongst them who would certainly be aware of that. The settlements were heaviest in Missouri, Iowa, Illinois, and Wisconsin. And in my looking at census material, by 1860, about 23,000 Irish families had settled into these lands. And those families, when I always count I always count farms as families, because it isn't a matter of an individual farmer. Farms are a matter of a family. It's male and female, and children are an essential part of having a farm. And so we need to look at all of that. And so this isn't the number of individuals. The number of individuals, at this point in time, is about 75,000. An additional 8,000 domestic servants, single women, were part of this immigration stream. These women most typically traveled and emigrated on their own and sought work as domestic servants, mostly in the cities and the towns, the county seats. There were fewer domestic servants in rural areas. And then laborers, about 27,000 laborers in these states. And laborers was a point of transition for many people. You had to work to get money before you could move on to your next station in life. So what things made them farmers, and we learned a lot, for instance, by simply looking at what happened in McLean County. This is an image of the Killian Farm, what is now the Killian Farm, in Lexington Township. It was built by the Joneses. Joneses were big stock owners, and this image was done in 1883 when the Joneses still owned it. The Killians then bought it a few years later. So how did these people become farmers? What they knew in Ireland was absolutely useless. It had no relevance to American farming. And O'Hanlon, the guy who I talked about previously, O'Hanlon flat out said that you need to work on a farm, and I'll give you that direct quote later. You need to work on an American farm before you can farm. And so many of them did that. They started out as laborers, and then they became tenant farmers where they rented land, and then if things really worked out, they ended up buying their own farm, like the Killians. To get money, they worked for the railroads, worked as canal diggers, they worked as laborers in digging drains, digging wells, doing a variety of things like that. Because this was new land, banks were willing to loan money because the scheme of settling the Corn Belt had to do with, from an international financial viewpoint, making the bondholders whole who paid for the cost of building the American railroad system. So the railroad systems are built on bonds, mostly English bonds, and those bondholders had to get their bonds paid off. And only by selling land, railroad land, and getting farmers on that who would produce a surplus, would then give railroads money because they could then hire out, they could ship out the surplus that these new farmers were going to produce. And so that, when you look at over that many square miles, how many hundreds of thousands of square miles in the Midwest, created tremendous opportunity, and bankers were more than happy to loan money because that helped build their own community, that got their own lands going, and they were very much aware of this whole relationship between getting people on the land to farm, to grow corn, and the corn goes into international markets. And this is just the way it was all through the Midwest. And by the way, because this commercial farming, because that's what it is, these people, they weren't potato growers, they were commercial farmers. And that created an export market that was so huge and so successful that it ended up destroying the serfdom system of Europe, because the serfs were less efficient producers of grain than the people in the States. And so we saw this created a second wave of migration. The success of corn growing in the Midwest created a new wave of migration out of the Scandinavian countries, out of Eastern Europe, because those serf systems would no longer work. So it's an interesting byproduct of all that. So what's that start with? The Anglo-Celt newspaper, and this was published in it's an Irish paper, I forget the town it's published in. Their advice to people coming over: get employed on a good farm if possible, and from that moment, go about with observing eyes, learn to chop, mow, plow, sow, and harvest after the American fashion. Now, a person who helped with this process was Isaac Funk of McLean County. Funk had, at this point in time in 1860-61, he had around 20,000 acres of McLean County farmland. And he was primarily raising livestock on it, and he needed corn farmers in order to grow corn to feed his cattle. So his way of exploiting the land was to ship cattle as his export. And he would sell hundreds and hundreds of heads of cattle in Chicago markets at the same time. And it took other people to do this work. And so he started out with hired hands, hiring the Irish as hired hands. And there is a population of about 120 Irish laborers in Mount Hope Township in 1860. Most of that, I can't say they're working for Funk, but I do know that's where the jobs were, okay? And so he was hiring this huge number of people. In 1861, war breaks out. The labor rates go up because of scarcity of labor, and these Irish laborers are aware of this and say, well, Mr. Funk, it's no longer $1 a day, it's $1.25 a day. And he being the kind of guy he was, he said, hell with it, I'm not doing that anymore. But what he did is he took the best of the farmers out of that group of laborers and said, how would you like to become a tenant farmer on a Funk farm? And I'll set you up that way. And so he started people in that process of not only They had learned a lot about farming working for him as a laborer, as a farmhand, but now can be tenants and learn the business side to a point where they're responsible for getting the crops and responsible for selling it. And he set up dozens of Irish families to do this, and if they did really well, then he'd sell them the farm. Now, one of the reasons that he was interested in selling farms at this point, by the way, was the increase of property taxes. And he thought, well, have the Irish pay the taxes, I'll still get the corn for my cattle. So through the years, this really grows. In 1880, there were in McLean County over 250 farms of over totaling 33,000 acres farmed by Irish. We had about 87 farmhands. Their farm size, not as big as they are today, about 100 acres was the average size, and of those, crops and livestock were produced. They pushed corn. It was a corn farming situation, 83,000 bushels. And this is the thing that made the difference, is because of the production value of the land. These guys who bought land at maybe 40 bucks an acre, or some of them 20 bucks an acre, they could, 20 years later, sell it for 4,000 an acre, a tenfold increase in value. And so because of this process, a lot of these farmers became extraordinarily wealthy. They did very well. And the ability to use that land became a thing of how do you keep this thing going that works so well. Women were an essential part of this. So I like to say the women took care of the two-legged animals on the farm. So that's ducks, geese, chicken, and husbands, okay? And they also were involved in producing butter for export, for city use, and also eggs. That was part of their work. So the family farms do quite well. Some of these people, when you read their obituaries, will, in 1902, will say so-and-so's estate, $400,000, okay? That's a lot of money today, right? In 1902 dollars, that's like a $2 million, $3 million estate. So again, these folks, it probably amazed them. The O'Neills got into this. They didn't farm. William O'Neill, one of the sons, bought a farm for every one of his children. He had 9 kids. And when he died, every kid inherited a farm, because that was the way he wanted to pass his wealth down, was in land, seeing the value of that. What was ironic is none of his kids wanted to farm. None of them, He had one daughter who married a Scotsman, and they farmed and did okay, but everybody else just rented their land out and drank it up. That's just the truth of the matter, what can I tell you? So we can look in McLean County at a good example of one of these little farm communities, which is Myrna, Illinois. And Myrna was settled originally in the 1860s, and it becomes a town because of the development of the Bloomer Line, which is a line, the Illinois Central Railroad line, that went to Kankakee, Illinois. And they founded the town, a guy by the name of James Myrna. Now, Myrna is an Irish name, last name. And the thing became kind of a hit. They wanted to really set the town off really well, so a year after the place starts, they kind of do a big feast that we're here. We've got an Irish settlement period. And they did, this is an interesting thing. The big holiday they decided to celebrate was the Feast of the Assumption. And it's a mixture, the way they did this was a mixture of Irish folk tradition with a nod to Catholic liturgy, just a nod. It was mostly an Irish folk festival. And they had a German band, they had dancing, they had drinking, they had horse races, they had gambling, they just had all kinds of fun, and it attracted, from town and country about 1,500 people, It became an opportunity to publicly express Irishness and success. It worked quite well. They built a church. And that church, this is the church that was taken down by the tornado in 1984. They claimed it would seat 500. I suppose if you have a lot of children, you're going to get 500 people in there, okay? And it had a post office, town hall. So it had actually two town halls, the German town hall and the Irish town hall. A railroad station, a grain elevator, and the church had a rectory, which was known, where they said, this is the finest house in the township. It wasn't, but you wouldn't let your priest think that he had a shoddy house, Just a few houses around it. So what it was a typical crossroads town, but one dominated by the Irish. And there's lots of stories about how they developed the town and how things worked out for them. I want to check my time here. Okay. So in any case, what I want to say there, they had an identity because of a place. And of course, and that's really important for any community. It's got to have some place where it's theirs. And in McLean County, the biggest one of those was Myrna. Now, we had farm families developing churches in Chenoa, churches in El Paso, churches in Lexington, churches in Downs. And so we had other small communities who were doing very similar kinds of things. But Myrna stands out simply because it's 100% Irish, well, almost 100%. There's this farmer from Myrna guy you've heard about. He got in the insurance business. What's his name? Maherl or something, By the way, if you look at the first 400 policyholders, about 3/4 of them are Irish. Okay, so he's selling to his neighbors. And what's he do when he hires his first employees? He hires Irish. So, he just, so there's a green base to State Farm. They ought to change their color to green, not red, In any case, that's the story. So what are we looking at in the future? Well, part of this is, what don't we know? You always have to ask yourself, what don't you know? And one of the things, and this is what I'm currently researching, is what's this transition from rural industrial employment, and by that I mean canal digging, railroad building, ditch digging. What's that transition leading to farming? And I'm studying LaSalle and Grundy County and finding that there is absolutely direct evidence of this, where LaSalle County by 1860 has 325 Irish farms, which is a lot. That's more than McLean County ever had. And so that's because of canal diggers. And right now I'm doing the census research that's going to allow me to put all that stuff together. We know nothing about the people who didn't make it. And one of the things that historians don't look at is those who leave light footprints. And this is going to be a very difficult piece to do, but we need to know, for instance, in McLean County, I know that only 1/3 of the Irish who started out farming remain farmers. So what happened to those 2/3? Now, some of them accidents, disease, that took some of them out. There's no question about that. Financial crashes took a lot of them out. Crashes of 1873, 1877, and 1892 ruined a lot for farming. I also know that a lot left farming in the 1880s and the 1890s because McLean County land was worth so much, now 4,000 an acre. McLean County land was worth so much that many of these farmers realized that their own children would not have the ability to farm in McLean County, and enabled them and helped them to move to the states of Nebraska and Kansas and take up farming there. And so there's an out move. In McLean County in total in 1892, 400 some farm families left and went to Nebraska and Iowa. And so that's a piece that I need to do more work on, and we need to know more about that process. And then how many people no longer associated themselves with being Irish? How many people chose a different identity? and did not want this Turalura life that we, so many of us get a kick out of, and wanted to set Turalura aside and be another kind of a person, an American perhaps, what they considered whatever that was. So those are questions that we need to know more about. So, as I say, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it, okay? That's what they say in the old movies. So if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to give you an answer or make something up if I don't know the answer.
I'll
Yes.
bring the microphone around so that folks online can hear your questions as well.
Were the Irish a big part of building the North-South Railroad that went through Bloomington?
Okay, the Irish were, I don't have exact figures because you don't know what the ethnic makeup of any particular railroad gang. From newspaper accounts, the Irish would be somewhere between a third and a half of the workforce, and then the biggest part would be Germans. So that's what is now Constitution Trail is what he's referring to, that railroad. Now what is now Amtrak, which goes from essentially St. Louis to Chicago, that was pretty much 100% Irish. And the contractors were Irish, and newspaper accounts put out that these are Irish. And that's what they're saying with the canal diggers up in LaSalle County. That was an Irish bit. The people who dug those canals were Irish. And so it's from those kinds of reports. Does that help? Okay.
Any other questions?
Did the Irish gain respect when they started to farm and become successful and help the banks and the economy in the Corn Belt grow?
It's a good question. Gaining respect from the banker, yeah, sure, if they paid their debts. And by 1900, the Irish had started their own bank called the Corn Belt Bank. So they wanted to protect their own interests that way. There was a substantial anti-Irish sentiment throughout the 19th century. There was, before the Civil War and at the time of immigration, a mass movement called the Know Nothings, who violently opposed Irish settlement across the United States. They were active here in McLean County. There were, in the 1880s, massive attacks on the part of certain Protestant ministers about Catholic faith and accusing priests and nuns of all kinds of outrageous conduct. And those preachers made a lot of money out of that. They had an audience that would give them a lot of money. And there was one guy in Stanford, Illinois, who was an nationally known rabble-rouser on this particular thing. He's got books published and whatnot. I think his name was White. And museum in his library has a couple of his books where he's a lecturer, so he wants to sell some books, So not only could you listen to the outrageous lies, but then you go home and read them too, And so there was a sentiment of religious bigotry that I would say they never really got through, and I would maintain today, well, I'm political, and I don't have to report to anybody anymore. I think what's going to happen, we're going to be seeing this, is when the Christian nationalists decide that it's okay to go ahead and start talking about the whore of Babylon of Rome, the Pope of Rome, and there's going to be a point where they're going to say, get comfortable in their own skin enough, where that particular ogre will be released. It's in them. It's been there. And so they're just waiting for a time to do that. That is not a statement approved of by the McLean County Museum of History or its supporters. That's a personal statement, okay? There's one back here, too.
Did you encounter any split within the Catholic Church, too, about whether these immigrants should stay in towns or should go into the farm? Any evidence of that in this area?
I did not find it in this area. There was a national split with Bishop Hughes of New York, Archbishop Hughes of New York, opposed Irish immigration into the West, and this was the West, because he felt that people would lose their faith because there were not sufficient priests in order for a person to be able to maintain their status as being a good Catholic. And the bishops of St. Louis and Dubuque absolutely disagreed with it. The Bishop of Dubuque, Martin Loris, was one of the most robust promoters of Western immigration. And so there was that kind of split. And Bishop Spalding of Peoria was involved in encouraging Irish city migration into farms. And there was an effort, John Ireland, Bishop Ireland in St. Paul, Minneapolis, and then Spalding worked together to try to develop different kinds of immigration schemes for Irish, and those all collapsed. None of them worked. And the reason why they didn't work is they ignored the rule, you know, if there is a rule, where the people they were settling on farms had not done that apprentice work. They had not been a hired hand, they had not been a tenant, and so they really didn't know how to farm in the American manner. And so they were basically set up for failure. Does that help, Bob? Okay.
Greg, I was sort of caught by your comment that most of the Irish came here from Liverpool, which is, of course, England, not Ireland. Do you want to explain just a little bit there?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that question, to clarify it. The O'Neills would be typical. They left County Cork on a packet from Cork City and took that directly to Liverpool. The Germans, they left Bremen, and their ships from Bremen went to Liverpool. Liverpool was the concentration point of immigrants. And so essentially you could go from Dublin, travel brokers would sell complete ticket systems where they would sell you a ticket to Liverpool. They would have lodging for you for up to 3-4 weeks, depending on what the system was in terms of who was supposed to leave when, the boats and whatnot. And so it was a very, there's a business end to it. But Liverpool was the gathering spot because of the concentration of shipping in their port with the size of their docks and whatnot. It was the best place for them to make their money in the Irish trade or the German trade. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Any other questions? Oh, great. Well, thank you all again for coming out today. How about a round of applause for Greg? I love that you included this promo for your book. It is available for purchase down in our Cruisin' with Lincoln on 66 Visitor Center and gift shop downstairs, and it is available on audiobook via Kindle if you prefer listening to your books. Please join us next month on April 11th. We'll be hosting a University of Illinois Extension educator who will be teaching us about sensory gardens and plants that you can add into your gardens at home to increase your sensory experience. So thank you all again for joining us, and we hope to see you next month. Take care.